we won't oppose this legislation and welcome the fact that there does seem to have been some lessons partially learned, at least, from the follies of the response to the crisis in 2008 and the austerity that followed it in the response of the European Union, its member states, and indeed here in Ireland, that we needed to not return to austerity but to inject money into maintaining jobs, investing in services, and adopting, I suppose, what you would call Keynesian policies rather than fiscal austerity policies. So that is to be welcomed. And the two specific mechanisms or schemes that we're talking about here, the SURE scheme, focused on supporting schemes to keep people in work, absolutely right. And that is absolutely critical that we should do that. And some expenditure, I understand, in terms of occupational health expenditure, and then the Pan-European Guarantee Fund about giving support and financing to SMEs primarily, although notably it also refers to middle and large scale companies, which may be justified, but I'll make a few points about that, how we do have to distinguish in our supports between the small enterprise that really needs the help and big enterprises where we should not be subsidising highly profitable entities and that they should have to pay us back essentially. And I do think we need to distinguish between those who are very small and who are faced with an existential threat of their survival, who shouldn't have strings attached to that support, but should get all the support we can to sustain them and their existence through this difficult period, and distinguish between those and large companies and corporations that can often benefit from these schemes, maybe not needing it and maybe not recognise their obligations to everybody else in terms of paying back that support. And I can't help in that regard but, you know, comment on the sort of day that's in it, because a lot of this is still about borrowing money, okay? And I'm for us borrowing money and injecting it into the economy, and I recognise interest rates are low and the various schemes are about giving low interest finance to states, to business, to schemes to keep people in work, or indeed, as the government are also intending to do, to just borrow on the markets. But we should put some provisos on the debt financing of stimulus, in my opinion. And I can't help but comment on the irony of where we're at, because it's not so long ago that the very same EU and the governments, including the two major parties in this country who are now promoting this more Keynesian approach, were telling us that we had to stick to a fiscal austerity model and that you couldn't debt finance your way out of a crisis, that it was dangerous to do it, and that it would produce an unsustainable debt burden and put us in a very vulnerable position. And now it seems all of that caution, all that prudence has gone out the window, and it's borrow, 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 borrow. Now, don't get me wrong, I disagreed with the fiscal austerity model when it was proposed, and some of us warned that the time would not be too far away when you'd realise the folly of the fiscal treaty, and that you'd have to borrow and break through these fiscal treaty parameters in order to deal with an economic crisis like the one we faced. And here we are. And suddenly all the rules now can be broken. You know, it's difficult not to comment on the irony of that, Ciaran Corla. But here we are, and lessons seem to have learned. But ironically, now I find myself in the let's be a little bit prudent camp. Because debt financing can't go on forever, and you eventually have to pay the piper. And somebody's making money when you're borrowing it from them. Always. Right? And it's rich people who are making money. Right? It's precisely the people with the inherited wealth and the vast accumulations of profit who are looking for somewhere to sustain and increase the value of that, who are lending us the money and want to be paid. And there is an alternative to that, and the 18 billion that the EU will decide on tomorrow sort of brings that into sharp relief. Because of course we wouldn't need to borrow the vast amounts of money we're just about to borrow, or in the process of borrowing, if we just took the 18 billion euro, or 13 billion euro plus interest from Apple. We wouldn't incur this debt burden and all the interest. So it's just worth saying that, because it is those accumulations of wealth and capital that we're borrowing from at interest. Maybe not directly Apple, but wherever they put their money, with some wealth asset management outfit, who then go and lend it to governments like ours, or to the European Union, and then get paid interest on it, just constantly accumulating their wealth. Well, we could short-circuit, and in my opinion we should short-circuit that process somewhat by just taking the tax money that they owe us back, and we wouldn't have to borrow so much. And it would transform our situation. So I do think it's important to say that, and particularly because the government after tomorrow is very likely to be faced with a decision as to whether it's going to appeal that judgment. And you can't separate, if you like, the considerations the government has in that regard and the discussion we're having here now, right? Because it has a direct bearing in terms of how much we have to borrow. And I say, borrow less and make the big corporations pay their fair share of taxes. And we could still fund the stimulus that we absolutely have to have. The other thing I would say, and there's some acknowledgement of that in these two schemes, but I do think we need to sort of write this large. And that is, a lot of the talk, understandably and correctly, in terms of stimulus, is focused on private business, SMEs and so on. And I absolutely agree with that, right? They need help, they're on the floor, and they should get that support. So don't get what I'm saying wrong here. But there seems to be a complete failure most of the time to acknowledge that the public sector is part of the plan to get us out of this crisis, or should be. And investment in that area is critical, because often the two are set against one another. Now, at the most obvious level, we need to recognise this is true, because what we learned during COVID-19 is if our health service is not able to cope, or is even threatened with the situation of not being able to cope with the health needs of our society, the entire economy, or most of it, shuts down. That's what we learned from this. And that's not an equation that most people would have accepted up until now. And there would have even this, oh, you know, there's too much money going into the public sector, what we need is to support the entrepreneur, as if the two were at odds with one another. But what we've learned, and I hope we never forget it, is that the private sector shuts down effectively if our health service isn't able to cope. And we better learn the lesson going forward. God, I hate that expression. But we better learn it, because this could have a very immediate impact on everything we're discussing here. Because all the stimulus of small enterprise in the world will be meaningless if our health service is overrun in the autumn because of a second wave and we have to shut the economy down again. It'll all be pointless. This entire discussion will be rendered meaningless. And what we know, and we learned, and we got testimony after testimony at the COVID committee, but I hope in the rush to get things back, the economy back up and running, the understandable desperation to get the economy back up and running, we do not forget that our public health service is running at such critically low levels of capacity that it would not take much for that system to be overrun. So if we have to raise, you know the famous graph, Count Corla? We have to raise the capacity bit of that graph very significantly. Because it's not just about the level of infection, it's about the level of infection related to the capacity of our health service to deal with it. And critically in that regard, the capacity is largely, I mean, some of it is capital capacity, if you know what I mean, building the physical infrastructure, having the ventilators, but most of it is about staff. We need urgently to recruit staff to our health service to increase the ICU capacity, to increase the bed capacity, to put the staffing and capacity levels into the nursing home sector and so on, GPs, you name it. Cradle to the grave healthcare that is able to cope with the sort of situation we are now in. And if we don't do that, and if we don't do it as a matter of urgency, all of this will be irrelevant if a second wave comes. And that focus on, if you like, the role of the public sector in sustaining the wider economy, and that you could make the same point about education. If we have to shut the schools down again, all of this will be irrelevant. If we have to shut the universities down again, all of this will be irrelevant. If childcare has to shut down again, all of this will be irrelevant, because people will be at home minding the kids and they won't be able to get out to work. Okay? If we have to shut down public transport. So the stimulus, as the government is considering what are they going to do with these funds, and indeed as the EU does, we need to understand a huge part of that stimulus programme has to be a massive increase in investment in the capacity of key public services and infrastructure in order to deal with the sort of crises we're now facing, and we're facing in the foreseeable future. And I sincerely hope that that lesson is learned. I would also like to say that it is critically important that we channel those supports towards, I think it was put very well by the EPIC working group, the events people who organised the gigs and the music industry and all the rest of them when they came into the COVID committee, and by the arts people, the people who've fallen through the cracks. Right? The individual sole traders, the musicians, the small business with a van that doesn't have a premises, that isn't rateable and so on, that isn't getting the support, hasn't been excluded in some cases from the supports. The supports need to be directed at them because they are in serious trouble. The taxi drivers who are not, they can't avail of any of the SME supports because they don't have rateable premises, and something to do with VAT, which frankly I don't fully understand, but anyway, there's something to do with VAT, that they don't, for that reason, they don't get the supports, but they need the supports, and they are faced with going under. So, I think that's all I have to say, Count Corla, is we will support this, or at least we will not oppose it, but I do think the government needs to, A, save incurring an unnecessary debt burden by actually making some of those who can afford to pay their taxes, like Apple, but also some of the corporate sector who haven't suffered, actually, even in this crisis. There are certain sectors who have done very well. I mean, I believe corporate tax receipts have held up remarkably and surprisingly well, because certain industries have not really been hit. The small guy has been hit, right? The people who've lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods, but some of the big corporations are actually doing well out of this crisis. Now, I think they should make a bit of a solidarity contribution to the rest of society. And we could finance some of the stimulus that we need that way, rather than just borrowing huge amounts of money and paying interest, probably to those very same people directly or indirectly. We need to recognise the role of the public sector, public services, public infrastructure and investment in terms of stimulus, and not just see it in terms of the private sector. And we need to support the people who are falling through the cracks. And sorry, very lastly, Ceann Comhairle, we need to make sure that all of this support is linked to decent wages and conditions for workers and for their trade union rights. There should be no question of giving support to entities that don't respect the right of workers to be paid properly, to have proper terms and conditions, and to have the right to be represented by the union or organisation of their choice. That is absolutely critical and should be a condition that is imposed on these stimulus supports.
Thank you very much, Deputy Boyd Barrett. Deputy Verona.